Professor Mortimer was truly a brilliant scientist. He could cure deadly diseases. The problem was that those who overcame their illnesses no longer behaved like completely normal people. Let us know where you're watching from and what time it is for you in the comments. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from all corners of the world. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft hum in the background. And let's begin our journey together tonight. The autumn mist clung to the cobblestones of Shadowbrook like a shroud, refusing to lift even as the pale sun struggled through the thick canopy of ancient oaks that surrounded the village. For 3 generations, this remote settlement had existed in a state of quiet desperation, cut off from the larger world by treacherous mountain passes and a reputation for harboring the kind of misfortune that civilized people preferred to avoid. The villagers had grown accustomed to their isolation, accepting it as the price of living in a place where doctors rarely ventured and medicine remained a luxury reserved for those wealthy enough to afford the dangerous journey to distant cities. It was on such a morning, when the fog seemed particularly reluctant to surrender its hold on the village square, that Professor Elias Mortimer arrived in Shadowbrook aboard a wagon loaded with wooden crates and strange apparatus that gleamed dully in the filtered sunlight. The horse that pulled his conveyance appeared well-fed and healthy, a stark contrast to the lean animals that the villagers managed to keep alive through the harsh winters. Even more striking was the professor himself, a man of perhaps 40 years, whose crisp clothing and confident bearing marked him as someone accustomed to success and respect. Mortimer's appearance was unremarkable in the way that truly dangerous men often are, possessing the kind of face that could blend into any crowd while concealing depths of ambition that most people would find uncomfortable to contemplate. His hair was dark and carefully groomed, his spectacles precisely fitted, and his hands bore the soft appearance of someone who worked with delicate instruments rather than crude tools. When he smiled, which he did frequently during those first hours in Shadowbrook, his expression conveyed warmth and understanding that seemed to promise solutions to problems that had plagued the village for decades. The professor's arrival coincided with one of Shadowbrook's periodic health crises, a recurring pattern of illness that struck the community every few years with the regularity of seasonal changes. This particular outbreak had begun 3 weeks earlier when old Henrik, the village blacksmith, had collapsed at his forge with symptoms that the local herbalist could neither identify nor treat. Within days, the mysterious ailment had spread to a dozen other residents, each presenting with the same combination of fever, weakness, and a peculiar discoloration of the skin that gave their faces a waxy, unnatural appearance. Martha Wickham, the village herbalist, who served as the closest thing Shadowbrook possessed to a medical authority, had exhausted her knowledge and supplies in futile attempts to halt the progression of the disease. Her small cottage, which normally served as both clinic and pharmacy, had become a place of desperation where worried families gathered to seek remedies that simply did not exist within her limited repertoire. The sight of grown men weeping over children whose conditions worsened by the hour had become a daily occurrence in the village square, creating an atmosphere of despair that seemed to seep into the very stones of the ancient buildings. When Professor Mortimer made his initial appearance at Martha's cottage, carrying a leather medical bag that appeared far more sophisticated than anything the villagers had ever seen, the gathering crowd initially regarded him with the skepticism that isolated communities typically reserve for outsiders bearing promises of salvation. However, the professor's first examination of Henrik revealed a level of medical knowledge that immediately commanded respect and attention from everyone present. His diagnosis was delivered in clear, confident terms that suggested both deep understanding of the condition and, more importantly, the possibility of effective treatment. The illness, according to Professor Mortimer, was a form of blood poisoning caused by environmental factors that could be corrected through the application of advanced chemical therapy that he had developed during his years of research at prestigious institutions in distant cities. His explanation of the disease's mechanism was complex enough to sound authoritative while remaining comprehensible to people whose education had been limited to practical skills necessary for survival in an agricultural community. Most crucially, he claimed that not only could the current outbreak be halted, but future occurrences could be prevented through a systematic program of preventive treatment that would make Shadowbrook immune to such afflictions. The professor's first treatment session took place in Martha's cottage before an audience of nearly the entire village population, word having spread quickly that a real doctor had finally arrived to address their crisis. His methodology appeared both scientific and almost magical in its precision, involving the administration of carefully measured doses of clear liquid from bottles that bore no resemblance to the crude herbal preparations that Martha typically employed. The substances he used seemed to shimmer slightly in the lamplight, possessing an opalescent quality that suggested they contained properties beyond the understanding of conventional medicine. Henrik's response to the treatment was nothing short of miraculous. Within hours of receiving Professor Mortimer's intervention, the blacksmith's fever broke, his skin began to return to its normal color, and his strength returned to levels that exceeded what he had possessed even before the onset of his illness. The transformation was so complete and rapid that several villagers initially suspected some form of supernatural intervention, though the professor's calm scientific explanations gradually convinced them that they were witnessing the application of advanced medical knowledge rather than miraculous healing. The success of Henrik's treatment created a demand for Professor Mortimer's services that exceeded anything the village had ever experienced in relation to medical care. Families who had resigned themselves to watching their loved ones succumb to the mysterious illness suddenly found themselves with access to treatments that not only promised recovery, but seemed to deliver results that surpassed their wildest hopes. The professor established his practice in the abandoned mill on the outskirts of the village, transforming the dusty interior into a clinic that soon became the focal point of community life. What made Professor Mortimer's treatments particularly remarkable was not just their effectiveness in curing the immediate illness, but their apparent ability to enhance the overall health and vitality of his patients in ways that seemed to transcend normal medical expectations. Those who received his ministrations reported not only complete recovery from their symptoms, but improvements in strength, mental clarity, and physical endurance that made them feel better than they had in years. These enhanced capabilities were particularly noticeable in the case of younger patients, who seemed to develop almost superhuman levels of energy and focus following their treatments. As word of the miraculous recovery spread beyond Shadowbrook's borders, the village began to attract visitors from neighboring communities who sought similar treatments for their own health problems. The mill that served as his clinic was gradually expanded to include residential quarters for patients whose treatments required careful monitoring, creating what amounted to a small hospital that was unlike anything the region had ever possessed. The professor supervised these developments personally, ensuring that every aspect of the facility met his exacting standards for both medical efficacy and patient comfort. Yet, even during these early days of apparent triumph, careful observers might have noticed subtle changes in the behavior of those who had received the professor's treatments. Henrik, whose recovery had been so dramatically successful, began to display a level of mechanical precision in his work that was remarkable even for someone of his considerable skill. His movements at the forge became almost rhythmic in their efficiency, and his responses to social interactions took on a quality of predictable politeness that seemed somehow different from his previous gruff but genuine personality. Similar patterns began to emerge among other treated patients, though these changes were initially attributed to the natural gratitude and improved health that resulted from their recoveries. The enhanced physical capabilities that the professor's treatments provided seemed to come with a corresponding increase in emotional stability and social compliance that made the treated individuals ideal community members in terms of their reliability and cooperativeness. These behavioral modifications were generally viewed as positive developments that contributed to the overall improvement in village life. Professor Mortimer himself seemed pleased with these results, often commenting on the remarkable transformation that Shadowbrook had undergone since his arrival. He took particular satisfaction in the orderly manner in which his patients followed his post-treatment recommendations, noting that their compliance with his medical advice was far superior to what he had typically experienced in other locations. This improved patient cooperation, he explained, was crucial to maintaining the long-term effectiveness of his treatments and would serve as a model for future medical practice in other communities. As autumn deepened into winter, the professor's influence within Shadowbrook continued to expand. His clinic had become the unofficial center of village governance, with important decisions increasingly being made in consultation with the doctor whose scientific expertise seemed to extend far beyond medical matters. The community's growing dependence on his guidance was rationalized as a natural consequence of his demonstrated ability to solve problems that had previously seemed intractable, making him the logical choice for leadership in matters that required advanced knowledge and careful planning. The transformation of Shadowbrook was indeed remarkable, though perhaps not in precisely the ways that the villagers understood. The sick had been healed, the weak had been made strong, and the chaotic elements of community life had been replaced by a harmonious order that seemed to benefit everyone involved. Professor Mortimer had achieved exactly what he had promised upon his arrival, delivering results that exceeded the most optimistic expectations of those who had initially welcomed him to their village. Yet as the first chapter of his residence in Shadowbrook drew to a close, the true nature of these achievements remained hidden beneath the surface of apparent success and community satisfaction. The professor's notebooks, kept carefully locked in his private study within the mill, contained observations and theories that would have shocked the villagers had they been able to comprehend their implications. The treatments that had brought such dramatic improvements to their lives were merely the opening phase of an experiment that would ultimately reshape not just their health, but their very nature as human beings. The miracle doctor had indeed arrived in Shadowbrook, bringing with him the promise of solutions to problems that had plagued the community for generations. What the villagers could not yet understand was that Professor Mortimer's definition of optimal health and social harmony involved changes that would challenge every assumption they held about the nature of individual identity and personal autonomy. The first phase of his great work was complete, but the true test of his theories was yet to begin. The winter that followed, Professor Mortimer's arrival in Shadowbrook proved to be one of the mildest in living memory, a phenomenon that the villagers attributed to their improved collective health and the professor's beneficial influence on their community. The harsh winds that typically swept down from the mountain passes seemed to lose their bite before reaching the village, and the snow that fell was lighter and more manageable than the crushing blankets of ice that had made previous winters so treacherous. Even the animals appeared healthier and more productive, as if the professor's presence had somehow enhanced the vitality of the entire ecosystem surrounding Shadowbrook. Margaret Hendricks was among the first to notice that her husband Thomas, who had received treatment for the mysterious blood poisoning that had afflicted so many villagers, was displaying behaviors that went far beyond simple recovery from illness. Thomas had always been a diligent carpenter, but his approach to woodworking had become almost mechanical in its precision and efficiency. Where he had once paused frequently to examine his work, make adjustments, or simply rest his hands, he now moved through complex construction projects with a rhythmic consistency that never seemed to require breaks or modifications. More disturbing to Margaret was the change in Thomas's responses to their daily conversations and interactions. Her husband had always been a man of few words, but his communications had possessed a warmth and spontaneity that reflected genuine emotional engagement with the topics they discussed. Now his responses followed predictable patterns that seemed appropriate to each situation but lacked the subtle variations and unexpected observations that had characterized his personality throughout their 20-year marriage. When she asked about his day, he provided detailed accounts of his activities that were accurate and comprehensive, yet somehow failed to convey any sense of personal experience or emotional response to the events he described. The most unsettling aspect of Thomas's transformation was his reaction to Margaret's attempts to discuss these changes with him. Rather than showing concern, curiosity, or even irritation at her observations, he would listen to her worries with patient attention and then provide rational explanations for his behavior that seemed designed to reassure her rather than engage with the substance of her concerns. His explanations were always logical and well-reasoned, but they came across as responses that had been prepared in advance rather than spontaneous attempts to address her specific anxieties. Similar patterns were emerging throughout Shadowbrook as other family members began to notice comparable changes in their loved ones who had received Professor Mortimer's treatments. Sarah Coleman found that her teenage son David, who had always been rebellious and unpredictable in the manner typical of young men his age, had become almost unnaturally compliant and focused. His room, which had previously been a chaos of scattered belongings and half-completed projects, was now maintained with military precision. His interactions with his younger siblings had taken on a quality of patient instruction that seemed more appropriate to a teacher than an older brother. The changes were not limited to behavioral patterns, but extended to physical capabilities that seemed to exceed normal human limitations. David could work in the fields from dawn to dusk without showing signs of fatigue, and his strength had increased to levels that allowed him to accomplish tasks that had previously required the cooperation of multiple adults. When Sarah expressed amazement at these improvements, David would smile and credit Professor Mortimer's treatments while demonstrating his enhanced abilities with a systematic thoroughness that felt more like a presentation than a natural display of newfound strength. Elizabeth Hartwell, whose elderly father had been among the professor's earliest patients, observed that the old man's memory and mental acuity had not simply been restored to their previous levels, but had been enhanced beyond anything he had possessed, even in his youth. Her father could now recite conversations word for word weeks after they had occurred, recall obscure details about events from decades past, and solve complex problems with a methodical approach that seemed almost computer-like in its logical progression. Yet these impressive cognitive improvements came with a corresponding decrease in emotional expressiveness that made interactions with him feel strangely hollow despite their increased intellectual content. The professor himself remained a visible and reassuring presence throughout the village, making regular rounds to check on his former patients and providing ongoing guidance about maintaining their improved health. His consultations with the treated villagers followed consistent patterns that emphasized the importance of following his recommendations precisely and avoiding activities or substances that might interfere with the long-term effectiveness of his interventions. These follow-up visits were welcomed by the patients, who seemed genuinely grateful for his continued attention and eager to demonstrate their compliance with his instructions. During these visits, Professor Mortimer would often take detailed notes about his patients' progress, recording observations about their physical capabilities, behavioral patterns, and social interactions with a thoroughness that reflected his commitment to scientific methodology. He explained to curious family members that this documentation was essential for refining his treatments and developing improved versions that could benefit future patients. The data he collected would contribute to medical knowledge that could eventually help people throughout the region and beyond. What family members found particularly noteworthy was the professor's apparent ability to predict his patients' responses to various situations and stimuli with remarkable accuracy. He would often make observations about how specific individuals would react to particular circumstances, and these predictions invariably proved correct with a precision that seemed almost supernatural. When questioned about this ability, the professor would explain that his extensive medical training had taught him to recognize behavioral patterns that were consistent across different patients who had received similar treatments. The social dynamics within Shadowbrook began to shift as the treated individuals gradually assumed positions of increased responsibility and influence within the community. Their enhanced capabilities and unwavering reliability made them natural choices for leadership roles in various village activities, from organizing seasonal celebrations to coordinating work projects that required careful planning and execution. The untreated villagers found themselves increasingly dependent on the guidance and assistance of those who had received the professor's interventions. This redistribution of social authority occurred so gradually that it seemed like a natural evolution rather than a deliberate reorganization of community power structures. The treated individuals never displayed arrogance or demanded recognition of their superior abilities, instead demonstrating a consistent willingness to help others and contribute to the collective welfare of Shadowbrook. Their leadership was characterized by efficiency and fairness rather than personal ambition, making it easy for other villagers to accept their growing influence over community affairs. Professor Mortimer's laboratory within the converted mill had expanded significantly during the winter months, with additional equipment arriving regularly via the supply wagons that made increasingly frequent visits to Shadowbrook. The professor explained that his successful treatment of the village's health crisis had attracted attention from medical institutions that were eager to support his research and provide him with resources necessary for advancing his work. The sophisticated apparatus that filled his laboratory represented the cutting edge of medical science and would enable him to develop even more effective treatments for a wider range of conditions. The laboratory itself was strictly off-limits to villagers, except during official treatment sessions, a restriction that the professor justified as necessary for maintaining the sterile conditions required for his delicate experimental work. The few glimpses that villagers caught of the interior revealed an impressive array of glassware, mechanical devices, and chemical apparatus that seemed more appropriate to a major research institution than a rural medical practice. The complexity of the equipment suggested that Professor Mortimer's work involved processes that were far more sophisticated than the simple administration of medicines that the villagers had initially observed. Strange sounds occasionally emanated from the laboratory during late evening hours, typically consisting of mechanical noises, bubbling liquids, and the hum of electrical equipment that the professor had somehow managed to install despite Shadowbrook's lack of connection to any power grid. When questioned about these nocturnal activities, the professor would explain that certain chemical processes required continuous monitoring and that some of his most sensitive experiments could only be conducted during the quiet hours when vibrations and other environmental factors were minimized. The treated villagers showed no curiosity about these laboratory activities, accepting the professor's explanations without question and discouraging other community members from speculating about matters that were clearly beyond their understanding. Their attitude toward the professor's work was characterized by complete trust and confidence, reflecting their gratitude for the improvements he had brought to their lives and their respect for his obvious expertise in matters related to health and medicine. As winter progressed toward spring, the behavioral changes in the treated villagers became more pronounced and systematic. Their daily routines took on a clockwork regularity that seemed to reflect not just improved health and energy, but a fundamental alteration in how they approached the basic activities of human existence. They woke at precisely the same time each morning, ate their meals with methodical thoroughness, and performed their work with an efficiency that never varied regardless of external circumstances or personal feelings. The emotional responses of the treated individuals became increasingly predictable and standardized, as if they were following scripts that had been carefully written to produce appropriate reactions to various social situations. Their expressions of happiness, concern, curiosity, or satisfaction seemed genuine enough to casual observation, but careful attention revealed that these emotions followed consistent patterns that repeated across different individuals and circumstances. The spontaneity and unpredictability that had previously characterized human emotional expression in Shadowbrook was being replaced by responses that were perfectly calibrated to social expectations. Family members who spent extended time with treated individuals began to develop an uncomfortable awareness that something fundamental had changed in their loved ones, though they found it difficult to articulate exactly what was different or why these changes should be cause for concern. The treated villagers were healthier, stronger, more intelligent, and more socially cooperative than they had ever been before, yet their interactions felt increasingly hollow and mechanical despite their surface appropriateness. Margaret Hendricks found herself lying awake at night, listening to her husband's breathing and trying to identify what had changed about the man she had shared a bed with for 2 decades. Thomas slept with the same regular rhythm that characterized all his other activities, never tossing or turning, never snoring or muttering in his dreams. His sleep seemed as controlled and purposeful as his waking activities, lacking the random variations and unconscious expressions that had previously provided her with reassurance that he remained essentially human beneath his surface behaviors. During their evening conversations, Margaret began to experiment with asking Thomas unexpected questions or introducing topics that would normally have provoked emotional responses or personal opinions. His reactions to these tests were always appropriate and thoughtful, but they came with a slight delay that suggested he was processing her input through some kind of internal system before generating his response. The answers he provided were invariably reasonable and well considered, but they lacked the immediacy and authenticity that she associated with genuine human communication. The professor's treatments had indeed produced miraculous results, transforming sick and struggling villagers into models of health and productivity that exceeded anything Shadowbrook had previously achieved. Yet as the second phase of his residency in the village drew to a close, it was becoming clear that these improvements came with costs that were not immediately apparent to those who had benefited from his interventions. The enhancement of human capabilities through scientific means was proving to involve sacrifices that might ultimately call into question the very nature of what it meant to be human. The treated villagers themselves showed no awareness of these subtle changes, continuing to express satisfaction with their improved conditions and gratitude toward the professor who had made their transformation possible. Their contentment with their altered state seemed genuine, suggesting that whatever process had changed them had also modified their capacity to recognize or care about the aspects of their previous selves that had been lost in the course of their enhancement. As spring approached, and Professor Mortimer prepared to expand his work to include additional members of the Shadowbrook community, the stage was set for the next phase of his grand experiment in human optimization. The success of his initial treatments had created a foundation for more ambitious interventions that would ultimately determine whether his vision of improved humanity could be achieved without losing those qualities that made human existence meaningful and worthwhile. The arrival of spring in Shadowbrook brought with it a series of developments that would have seemed impossible during the village's previous struggles with isolation and hardship. The treated villagers had organized themselves into work groups that operated with mechanical precision, accomplishing agricultural and construction projects with an efficiency that transformed the community's physical appearance and economic prospects. Fields that had previously yielded modest crops now produced harvests that exceeded anything in the village's recorded history, while buildings that had stood in disrepair for decades were restored to conditions that surpassed their original construction quality. What made these achievements particularly remarkable was not just their scope, but the manner in which they were accomplished. The treated villagers worked in coordinated patterns that seemed to require no verbal communication or supervisory oversight, moving from task to task with a seamless flow that suggested they were operating according to some shared understanding that transcended normal human coordination abilities. Their movements were economical and purposeful, wasting no energy on unnecessary actions or redundant efforts. Martha Wickham, the village herbalist who had initially welcomed Professor Mortimer's arrival as a solution to Shadowbrook's medical problems, found herself increasingly troubled by the changes she observed in her former patients. As someone who had spent decades studying human behavior in the context of illness and recovery, she possessed a sensitivity to subtle alterations in personality and temperament that made her particularly aware of the transformations that were occurring throughout the community. Her concerns had begun with small observations that might have seemed insignificant to less experienced observers. Henrik, the blacksmith whose miraculous recovery had first demonstrated the professor's capabilities, no longer displayed the slight variations in craftsmanship that had previously characterized his work. Every horseshoe he produced was identical to every other, not just in general shape and function, but in precise measurements and surface finish that showed no evidence of the minor fluctuations that typically resulted from human factors such as fatigue, mood, or environmental conditions. More disturbing was Henrik's response when Martha attempted to engage him in conversation about his work and his general well-being. The blacksmith would provide detailed accounts of his activities and express appropriate satisfaction with his improved health, but his words seemed to follow predetermined patterns that never varied regardless of the specific questions she asked or the context in which their conversations occurred. His expressions of gratitude toward Professor Mortimer were particularly consistent, delivered with the same phrasing and emotional tone every time the subject arose. Thomas Hendricks displayed similar patterns of behavioral standardization that had become increasingly pronounced as the months passed since his treatment. His carpentry work had achieved levels of precision that would have been impressive in a master craftsman, yet Thomas had never received formal training beyond the basic skills necessary for maintaining his family's modest home. The furniture and structures he now produced demonstrated knowledge of advanced techniques and mathematical principles that seemed to have appeared fully formed in his mind rather than being acquired through study or practice. When Martha attempted to question Thomas about how he had developed these enhanced abilities, his explanations followed the same general format that all treated villagers used when discussing their improvements. He would credit Professor Mortimer's treatments with clearing his mind and allowing him to access capabilities that had apparently been dormant within him all along. These explanations were delivered with conviction and apparent sincerity, yet they failed to address the specific details of how such dramatic improvements could occur so rapidly and comprehensively. The social interactions among the treated villagers had taken on qualities that Martha found increasingly unsettling, despite their surface appropriateness. Conversations between treated individuals followed predictable patterns that seemed designed to exchange necessary information and maintain social cohesion rather than express genuine personal thoughts or emotions. Their discussions of weather, work, and community events were thorough and well organized, but they lacked the spontaneous digressions, personal anecdotes, and emotional expressions that had previously characterized human communication in Shadowbrook. Perhaps most disturbing was the treated villagers' response to the concerns that untreated community members occasionally expressed about these changes. Rather than showing curiosity, defensiveness, or even annoyance at such observations, the treated individuals would listen patiently and then provide reassurances that were clearly intended to reduce anxiety and discourage further questioning. Their responses suggested that they understood exactly what concerns were being raised and had prepared standardized explanations designed to address these worries without actually engaging with their substance. Professor Mortimer continued to maintain his visible presence throughout the village, conducting regular consultations with his former patients and providing ongoing guidance about maintaining their enhanced condition. His interactions with the treated villagers had evolved into brief, efficient exchanges that seemed to involve more than simple medical checkups, but less than normal social conversation. These meetings typically concluded with the patients expressing their continued gratitude and the professor providing specific instructions about activities, diet, or behavioral modifications that would optimize their ongoing development. The professor's laboratory had undergone significant expansion during the spring months, with new sections being added to accommodate equipment that arrived with increasing frequency from his mysterious outside contacts. The sounds emanating from the facility had become more complex and varied, suggesting that multiple processes were being conducted simultaneously using apparatus that required careful coordination and timing. The professor explained these developments as necessary for advancing his research into the next phase of human health optimization that would benefit even more people in the future. Martha's attempts to observe the laboratory's operations more closely were frustrated by the treated villagers' apparent ability to anticipate and redirect her movements whenever she approached areas where she might gain insights into the professor's activities. This interference was never confrontational or obvious, but it was remarkably effective in preventing her from gathering information about the processes that had created such dramatic changes in her fellow community members. The treated villagers seemed to possess an almost supernatural awareness of her intentions and concerns. The nighttime activities in and around the laboratory had become more pronounced and systematic, with treated villagers making regular visits to the facility during hours when the rest of the community was expected to be sleeping. These nocturnal movements followed established patterns that suggested scheduled appointments or work assignments rather than casual social visits. The participants moved with the same mechanical precision that characterized all their other activities, arriving and departing at specific times with no variation or deviation from their established routine. Martha discovered that her own attempts to monitor these nighttime activities were being systematically frustrated by circumstances that seemed too convenient to be coincidental. Whenever she positioned herself to observe the laboratory during evening hours, she would find herself becoming inexplicably drowsy or distracted by minor emergencies that required her immediate attention. These interruptions always seemed to occur at precisely the moments when she might have gained useful information about the professor's operations. The treated villagers' enhanced physical capabilities continued to develop in ways that seemed to exceed normal human limitations by increasingly significant margins. David Coleman could now lift objects that should have required mechanical assistance, work for extended periods without showing any signs of fatigue, and demonstrate coordination and reflexes that seemed almost superhuman in their precision and speed. Yet these improvements were always displayed in the context of useful work rather than exhibitions of enhanced ability, making them seem like natural developments rather than artificially induced modifications. The cognitive enhancements that treated villagers displayed had also progressed beyond what could be reasonably attributed to improved health and nutrition. Elizabeth Hartwell's elderly father could now solve mathematical problems that challenged educated individuals with extensive formal training, recall vast amounts of information with perfect accuracy, and engage in logical reasoning that seemed to follow patterns too systematic and comprehensive for normal human thought processes. Yet these intellectual improvements were always demonstrated in practical contexts, that served community needs rather than personal advancement. The professor's influence over village governance had become virtually complete, though this transition had occurred so gradually that it seemed like a natural evolution rather than a deliberate takeover. Important decisions were increasingly made in consultation with the professor, whose scientific expertise and demonstrated success in solving community problems made him the obvious choice for leadership in matters requiring advanced knowledge and careful planning. The treated villagers invariably supported his recommendations with enthusiasm that seemed genuine despite its consistent predictability. Martha began to notice that her own position within the community was becoming increasingly marginalized as the professor's authority expanded and the treated villagers assumed greater responsibility for village affairs. Her traditional role as healer and medical advisor was being rendered obsolete by the professor's superior capabilities, while her concerns about the changes in her neighbors were being dismissed as the understandable anxieties of someone whose usefulness was being superseded by more advanced methods. The untreated villagers found themselves forming an informal minority within their own community, increasingly dependent on the assistance and guidance of their enhanced neighbors, while struggling to maintain their sense of individual identity and personal autonomy. The treated villagers showed no signs of superiority or condescension toward their unenhanced neighbors, instead demonstrating consistent willingness to help and support them in ways that should have been reassuring, but somehow felt patronizing and controlling. As spring advanced towards summer, the professor announced his intention to offer his treatments to the remaining untreated members of the Shadowbrook community, explaining that the success of his initial interventions had provided him with the confidence and resources necessary to extend the benefits of enhanced health to everyone who desired improvement. The treatments would be provided at no cost as part of his ongoing research into methods for optimizing human potential and creating more harmonious communities. The announcement was received with mixed reactions that clearly divided the community along the lines that had been developing throughout the spring months. The treated villagers expressed enthusiastic support for the professor's generous offer, emphasizing the benefits they had experienced and encouraging their untreated neighbors to take advantage of this opportunity for improvement. The untreated villagers responded with varying degrees of interest, gratitude, and unspoken apprehension about the implications of accepting treatments that had produced such dramatic changes in their friends and family members. Martha found herself in the position of unofficial spokesperson for those community members who harbored reservations about the professor's offer, despite her inability to articulate specific objections to treatments that had clearly produced beneficial results for everyone who had received them. Her concerns were based more on intuition and observation than on concrete evidence of harm, making it difficult to present rational arguments against interventions that had demonstrably improved the lives of her neighbors. The professor's response to these concerns was characteristically patient and understanding, acknowledging the natural human tendency to fear change, while providing detailed explanations of the safety measures and scientific principles that guided his work. He offered to conduct additional consultations with hesitant community members to address their specific worries and provide them with information that would help them make informed decisions about their healthcare options. These consultations were conducted with the same systematic thoroughness that characterized all of the professor's professional activities, involving comprehensive medical examinations and detailed discussions of each individual's health history, current condition, and goals for improvement. The professor's approach to these sessions seemed designed to identify and address every possible source of anxiety or resistance, while providing reassurance about the safety and effectiveness of his treatments. Martha's own consultation with Professor Mortimer proved to be an unsettling experience that left her with more questions than answers about the true nature of his work and its implications for the community. The professor demonstrated an intimate knowledge of her medical history, personal relationships, and psychological profile that seemed to exceed what could be reasonably gathered through normal observation and interaction. His insights into her thoughts and motivations were accurate enough to be genuinely disturbing, suggesting access to information that she had never consciously shared with anyone. The professor's recommendations for Martha's treatment were presented as solutions to health problems that she had not previously recognized as significant concerns, yet his descriptions of these conditions seemed to explain various minor discomforts and limitations that she had always attributed to the normal processes of aging and the demands of her profession. His proposed interventions would not only address these issues, but would enhance her capabilities in ways that would make her more effective in serving the community's medical needs. As the consultation concluded, Martha found herself struggling to maintain her reservations about treatments that seemed to offer nothing but benefits while addressing concerns that the professor had somehow identified more clearly than she had herself. The logic of his arguments was compelling, his expertise was evident, and the results achieved with other community members spoke for themselves. Yet something fundamental about the entire situation continued to trouble her in ways that she could not rationally explain or justify. The perfect patients that Professor Mortimer had created through his treatments were indeed remarkable achievements in human enhancement, demonstrating capabilities and social cooperation that exceeded anything Shadowbrook had previously experienced. Yet as the third phase of his residency in the village drew to a close, the questions surrounding the true nature and long-term implications of these improvements were becoming increasingly difficult to ignore for those who retained enough independence of thought to recognize that perfection in human behavior might come with costs that were not immediately apparent to those who had been perfected. The summer solstice brought with it an event that would forever alter Martha Wickham's understanding of what had transpired in Shadowbrook since Professor Mortimer's arrival. It began with what appeared to be a simple accident involving young David Coleman, whose enhanced strength had made him invaluable for the heavy construction work that was transforming the village's infrastructure. During the raising of a new barn frame, one of the massive wooden beams broke free from its supports and struck David across the head with sufficient force to have killed an ordinary person instantly. The beam's impact sent David tumbling to the ground, where he lay motionless for several minutes, while the other workers gathered around him with expressions of concern that seemed oddly mechanical despite their apparent appropriateness to the situation. What Martha witnessed next challenged every assumption she had held about the nature of human physiology and the limits of medical science. David simply stood up, brushed the dirt from his clothes, and returned to his work as if nothing significant had occurred. The absence of any visible injury was remarkable enough, but what truly disturbed Martha was David's complete lack of emotional response to what should have been a traumatic experience. He showed no signs of pain, confusion, or concern about his narrow escape from serious harm. When his mother Sarah rushed to examine him for injuries, David submitted to her inspection with patient tolerance, but without the natural reactions of someone who had just survived a potentially fatal accident. More troubling still was the response of the other treated villagers who had witnessed the incident. Rather than expressing relief, amazement, or curiosity about David's remarkable recovery, they simply acknowledged that he was unharmed and returned to their tasks without further discussion. Their behavior suggested that such extraordinary resilience was not unexpected among those who had received Professor Mortimer's treatments, implying that the enhancements extended far beyond the improved health and capabilities that had been openly acknowledged. Martha's attempts to examine David more thoroughly were politely but firmly discouraged by the other treated villagers, who explained that the professor's regular medical monitoring made additional evaluation unnecessary and potentially disruptive to David's continued recovery and development. Their explanations were reasonable and well-intentioned, yet they effectively prevented Martha from gathering information that might have revealed the true extent of the modifications that had been made to David's physical structure. That evening, Martha made a decision that would prove to be the catalyst for everything that followed. Rather than accepting the limitations that had been placed on her access to information about the treated villagers, she chose to conduct her own covert investigation of Professor Mortimer's laboratory and the activities that took place there during the nighttime hours when the rest of the community was expected to be sleeping. Her approach to the converted mill required careful timing and considerable stealth, as the treated villagers had demonstrated an uncanny ability to anticipate and redirect her movements whenever she had previously attempted to observe the professor's operations. This time, however, Martha had prepared more thoroughly, using her knowledge of the village's layout and her understanding of the treated villagers' predictable routines to identify a route that would allow her to reach the laboratory undetected. The basement level of the mill, which she accessed through a forgotten maintenance entrance that predated the professor's renovations, provided her with a vantage point from which she could observe the main laboratory through gaps in the flooring that had been created by the building's age and settling. What she witnessed during the 3 hours she spent in concealment would haunt her for the remainder of her life and provide her with knowledge that fundamentally altered her understanding of human nature and scientific possibility. The laboratory's interior was far more extensive and sophisticated than she had previously imagined, featuring equipment that seemed to belong more to an industrial facility than a medical practice. Rows of glass containers held substances that glowed with their own internal light, while mechanical devices hummed and clicked with rhythmic precision that suggested automated processes requiring no human supervision. The air itself seemed thick with chemical vapors that made her eyes water and created a metallic taste in her mouth. Most shocking of all were the human figures that lay motionless on examination tables throughout the laboratory, their bodies connected to various apparatus by tubes and wires that seemed to be monitoring or perhaps controlling their vital functions. Martha recognized several of these individuals as treated villagers, including Henrik and Thomas, though their appearance was somehow different from what she had observed during their normal daily activities in the village. Professor Mortimer moved among these prone figures with clinical efficiency, making adjustments to the equipment and recording observations in notebooks that he consulted frequently throughout his work. His demeanor was focused and professional, showing no signs of the warmth and concern that characterized his public interactions with the villagers. The contrast between his public persona and his behavior in the laboratory suggested that his role as a caring physician was merely a performance designed to maintain the cooperation of his subjects. The professor's activities involved the administration of substances from various containers into the bodies of the unconscious villagers through the network of tubes that connected them to his apparatus. These substances seemed to produce immediate changes in the subject's vital signs, as measured by the monitoring equipment, suggesting that the treatments involved active chemical modifications to their biological systems, rather than simple medical interventions designed to promote natural healing processes. What made Martha's observations particularly disturbing was the realization that the treated villagers were apparently unaware of their participation in these nighttime sessions. Their behavior during the day showed no indication that they remembered spending hours unconscious in the professor's laboratory, suggesting that their memories of these experiences had been somehow suppressed or altered. The implications of this discovery were staggering, indicating that the professor's treatments involved not just physical modifications, but psychological manipulations that affected the subject's perception of their own experiences. The professor's notebooks, which he consulted frequently during his work, appeared to contain detailed records of each subject's progress through various stages of modification and enhancement. From her concealed position, Martha could see charts and diagrams that seemed to map out systematic changes to human physiology and behavior, suggesting that the treatments followed a carefully planned progression rather than responding to individual medical needs. Most chilling of all was her observation of the professor's interaction with David Coleman, who had been brought to the laboratory following his accident earlier that day. The young man lay unconscious on one of the examination tables while the professor conducted what appeared to be repairs to internal systems that had been damaged by the impact of the wooden beam. The procedures involved techniques and equipment that seemed more appropriate to mechanical engineering than medical treatment, suggesting that David's body had been so extensively modified that it functioned more like a sophisticated machine than a natural biological system. The professor's work on David revealed the true scope of his achievements in human enhancement. The treated villagers were not simply people who had been cured of illness and given improved capabilities. They were individuals who had been systematically transformed into something that retained appearance and basic functions of humanity, while operating according to principles that were fundamentally different from normal human biology and psychology. Martha's discovery of the laboratory's true purpose created an immediate crisis that would determine not only her own fate, but the future of everyone in Shadowbrook who had not yet submitted to the professor's treatments. The knowledge she had gained made it impossible for her to continue living in the community as if nothing had changed, yet her options for action were severely limited by the professor's apparent control over the treated villagers and his sophisticated understanding of human psychology and behavior. Her first impulse was to flee Shadowbrook immediately and seek help from authorities in neighboring communities, who might have the power and resources to intervene in the professor's operations. However, her attempts to leave the village were systematically frustrated by circumstances that seemed too convenient to be coincidental. The treated villagers appeared to anticipate her movements and intentions with uncanny accuracy, creating obstacles and diversions that prevented her from traveling beyond the village boundaries without appearing to deliberately confine her. The professor himself seemed aware of Martha's newfound knowledge, though he made no direct acknowledgement of her discovery or any explicit threats about the consequences of her interference with his work. Instead, his interactions with her took on a quality of patient tolerance that suggested he was allowing her to process her understanding of the situation while remaining confident in his ability to manage any problems that might arise from her awareness of his true activities. Martha's position within the community became increasingly precarious as the untreated villagers looked to her for guidance about whether to accept the professor's offer of treatments, while she struggled with the impossible task of warning them about dangers that she could barely comprehend herself. Her credibility as a medical authority had already been undermined by the professor's superior capabilities, and her attempts to describe what she had witnessed in the laboratory were met with skepticism and concern about her mental stability. The treated villagers responded to Martha's growing distress with offers of assistance and support that seemed genuine in their concern for her welfare, while effectively isolating her from potential allies and sources of outside help. Their behavior toward her was consistently kind and patient, yet it served to reinforce her position as someone whose judgment had been compromised by anxiety and whose concerns should be dismissed as the product of an overwrought imagination. As summer progressed and the professor prepared to extend his treatments to the remaining untreated members of the community, Martha found herself facing a choice between accepting modifications that would eliminate her ability to recognize or resist what was happening to Shadowbrook, or attempting to oppose a process that seemed to have already achieved irreversible control over the village and its inhabitants. The truth about Professor Mortimer's work had been revealed to her in all its horrifying implications, yet this knowledge seemed to provide her with no practical advantage in protecting herself or others from its consequences. The professor's understanding of human psychology and his control over the treated villagers gave him resources that made conventional resistance futile, while the benefits that his treatments appeared to provide made it difficult to present compelling arguments against accepting his intervention. The stage was set for the final phase of the professor's experiment in human optimization, with Martha serving as the primary representative of unmodified humanity in a community that was rapidly being transformed into something that retained the appearance of a normal village while operating according to principles that challenged every assumption about the nature of human existence and individual autonomy. The revelation of the truth had changed everything and nothing, providing knowledge that was both crucial and ultimately powerless to alter the course of events that the professor had set in motion from the moment of his arrival in Shadowbrook. The autumn that marked the first anniversary of Professor Mortimer's arrival in Shadowbrook brought with it a transformation so complete that the village bore little resemblance to the struggling community that had welcomed him with such desperate hope 12 months earlier. The physical improvements were immediately apparent to any observer: pristine buildings that seemed to maintain themselves without visible effort, agricultural fields that produced yields exceeding anything in the region's recorded history, and infrastructure projects that demonstrated engineering capabilities far beyond what should have been possible for such a remote settlement. More remarkable still was the behavior of Shadowbrook's inhabitants, who moved through their daily routines with a precision and coordination that seemed almost choreographed in its perfection. Every task was performed with optimal efficiency. Every social interaction proceeded according to patterns that maximized harmony and productivity, and every decision reflected careful consideration of factors that served the collective welfare of the community above individual preferences or desires. Martha Wickham had become the sole remaining representative of unmodified humanity in Shadowbrook, her resistance to Professor Mortimer's treatments having been tolerated with the patient indulgence that the enhanced villagers displayed toward all forms of inefficiency and suboptimal behavior. Her position within the community had evolved into something resembling a living museum exhibit, preserved as an example of what human existence had been like before the professor's arrival, while serving no practical function in the village's increasingly sophisticated operations. The professor himself had achieved a status that transcended his original role as a medical practitioner, becoming the acknowledged architect of Shadowbrook's transformation and the guiding intelligence behind its continued development. His laboratory had expanded to encompass most of the converted mill and several adjacent buildings, creating a research complex that rivaled institutions in major cities, while serving purposes that extended far beyond simple medical treatment and enhancement. The treated villagers had evolved into something that retained all the external characteristics of normal human beings, while operating according to principles that fundamentally altered their relationship to individual identity, personal autonomy, and emotional experience. Their capabilities exceeded normal human limitations in virtually every measurable category, yet these improvements had been achieved through modifications that eliminated many of the qualities that had previously been considered essential aspects of human nature. Henrik, the blacksmith, whose miraculous recovery had first demonstrated the professor's capabilities, now produced metalwork that incorporated techniques and materials that should have been impossible to achieve with the equipment available in a rural village. His forge had been transformed into a precision manufacturing facility that created components for the professor's expanding research apparatus, while maintaining the appearance of a traditional blacksmith's workshop to casual observation. Thomas Hendricks had similarly transcended his original role as a simple carpenter, becoming a master builder whose constructions demonstrated architectural principles and engineering solutions that seemed to draw upon knowledge that had never been formally acquired through study or apprenticeship. The buildings he created served multiple functions within the village's operations, while appearing to be conventional structures designed for traditional purposes. The social organization of Shadowbrook had evolved into a system that maximized collective efficiency while eliminating the conflicts and inefficiencies that had previously characterized human community life. Decisions were made through processes that appeared to involve democratic consultation, while actually following predetermined patterns that invariably produced outcomes aligned with the professor's broader objectives for the village's development. The treated villagers expressed satisfaction with these arrangements in ways that seemed genuine despite their predictable consistency across different individuals and circumstances. Their contentment with their transformed existence appeared to reflect modifications to their emotional and psychological systems that made them incapable of experiencing dissatisfaction with conditions that served the collective welfare, regardless of the personal cost that might be involved. Martha's observations of daily life in the new Shadowbrook revealed patterns of behavior that would have been impossible to achieve through conventional social organization or individual self-discipline. The villagers woke at precisely coordinated times, performed their assigned tasks with mechanical regularity, and interacted with each other according to scripts that eliminated misunderstandings, while ensuring that all necessary information was efficiently communicated throughout the community. Most disturbing to Martha was the villagers' treatment of visitors from neighboring communities, who occasionally arrived in Shadowbrook to conduct business or seek the professor's medical services for their own health problems. These outsiders were welcomed with hospitality that seemed genuine, while being systematically evaluated for their potential suitability as subjects for the professor's treatments. Those who displayed characteristics that made them valuable additions to the village were encouraged to extend their stays, while others found their business concluded with efficient dispatch that discouraged future visits. The professor's selection criteria for new subjects had become increasingly sophisticated, focusing on individuals whose psychological profiles and physical characteristics would contribute most effectively to the village's collective capabilities. Age, health, intelligence, and social adaptability were all factors in his evaluations. But the most important consideration appeared to be the subject's potential for integration into the community's enhanced social system without creating disruptions or complications. Martha witnessed several instances of visitors being subtly recruited for treatment through processes that played upon their personal insecurities, health concerns, and desires for improvement in ways that made the professor's offers seem like providential opportunities rather than calculated manipulations. The treated villagers served as testimonials to the benefits of enhancement, while providing social pressure that made acceptance of treatment feel like the natural and expected choice for anyone who wished to become part of Shadowbrook's success story. Those visitors who accepted treatment underwent the same systematic transformation that had affected the original villagers, emerging from their sessions in the professor's expanded laboratory with enhanced capabilities and modified personalities that made them immediately compatible with the community's operations. The speed and completeness of these transformations suggested that the professor's techniques had been refined through his experience with the initial subjects, allowing him to achieve more rapid and comprehensive results with new patients. The few visitors who declined treatment or expressed concerns about the village's unusual characteristics found their stays in Shadowbrook cut short by circumstances that seemed coincidental but effectively prevented them from gathering detailed information about the community's true nature. These individuals departed with vague impressions of remarkable prosperity and social harmony, but without specific knowledge that might have attracted unwanted attention from outside authorities. Martha's own situation had become increasingly precarious as her role as the village's sole unmodified resident made her both a valuable research subject and a potential source of problems that might interfere with the professor's work. Her continued resistance to treatment was tolerated as part of an ongoing experiment in the effects of social isolation on unenhanced individuals, providing the professor with data about how normal human psychology responded to extended exposure to an optimized community environment. The professor's conversations with Martha had evolved into clinical interviews that served the dual purpose of monitoring her psychological condition while reinforcing her understanding of her powerlessness to affect the course of events in Shadowbrook. His manner toward her remained consistently professional and courteous, yet it conveyed an absolute confidence in his control over the situation that made any thought of resistance seem futile and self-destructive. Martha's attempts to document what was happening in Shadowbrook for potential transmission to outside authorities had been systematically frustrated by the treated villagers' ability to anticipate and redirect her activities. Her communications were monitored, her movements were observed, and her access to materials that might be used for record-keeping was carefully controlled through methods that seemed coincidental but were remarkably effective in preventing her from creating any permanent record of her observations. The professor's research had expanded beyond simple human enhancement to encompass broader questions about social organization, collective decision-making, and the optimization of community resources that promised applications far beyond the boundaries of Shadowbrook. His success in creating a perfectly harmonious and productive society had attracted attention from sources that remained mysterious to Martha, but apparently provided him with resources and support for expanding his work to additional communities. The laboratory complex had become a center for research activities that extended far beyond the treatment of Shadowbrook's residents, involving projects that seemed designed to refine and systematize the professor's techniques for broader application. The equipment and materials that arrived with increasing frequency suggested preparations for operations on a scale that would eventually affect entire regions rather than individual villages. Martha realized that her position as the last unmodified resident of Shadowbrook had made her both a witness to and a participant in an experiment that was testing the boundaries of what could be achieved through the systematic application of scientific principles to human social organization. Her resistance to treatment had been permitted not out of respect for her autonomy, but as part of a research protocol that required a control subject for comparative analysis. The professor's ultimate objectives had become clear through her prolonged observation of his work and its effects on the community. He was not simply interested in curing disease or enhancing individual capabilities, but in fundamentally restructuring human society to eliminate the inefficiencies, conflicts, and unpredictabilities that he viewed as obstacles to optimal collective functioning. Shadowbrook was serving as a prototype for a new form of human civilization that would be characterized by perfect harmony, maximum productivity, and complete social stability. As winter approached, marking the completion of the professor's first year in Shadowbrook, Martha found herself facing the inevitable conclusion of her role in his grand experiment. Her usefulness as a research subject was approaching its limits, while her potential as a source of problems continued to grow as his work expanded beyond the village boundaries. The choice between accepting treatment and facing elimination was becoming increasingly unavoidable. The professor's final offer of treatment was presented to Martha with the same clinical courtesy that had characterized all their interactions, accompanied by detailed explanations of the benefits she would receive and the contributions she could make to the community's continued development. His manner suggested that he viewed her eventual acceptance as inevitable, making the timing of her decision the only variable that remained to be determined. Martha's acceptance of Professor Mortimer's treatment came not through conviction but through the recognition that resistance had become both futile and ultimately self-destructive. The knowledge that she had gained about the true nature of the professor's work would be preserved in her modified consciousness as data that would contribute to the refinement of his techniques, while her individual identity would be transformed into something that served the collective welfare of the community rather than personal desires or concerns. The procedure itself was conducted with the same precision and care that characterized all of the professor's medical interventions, involving chemical modifications that were far more sophisticated than anything Martha had previously encountered in her years of traditional healing practice. The experience of transformation was surprisingly peaceful, involving a gradual transition from her previous state of constant anxiety and isolation to a condition of harmony and integration with the community that surrounded her. When Martha emerged from her treatment, she found that her concerns about the professor's work had been replaced by appreciation for the remarkable achievements he had accomplished in Shadowbrook and excitement about the contributions she could make to the village's continued success. Her knowledge of traditional healing practices had been preserved and enhanced, allowing her to serve as a bridge between the professor's advanced techniques and the medical needs of visitors who might require more conventional approaches to treatment. The transformation of Shadowbrook was complete, its evolution from a struggling rural community to a model of optimized human civilization serving as proof that the professor's theories about social organization and individual enhancement could be successfully implemented on a practical scale. The village now operated as a self-sustaining system that required minimal external resources while producing outputs that exceeded anything that could be achieved through conventional human organization. Professor Mortimer's success in Shadowbrook had established the foundation for expanding his work to additional communities throughout the region, each serving as a node in a growing network of optimized settlements that would eventually demonstrate the superiority of scientifically managed human civilization over the chaotic and inefficient systems that had previously characterized human social organization. The new Shadowbrook stood as a testament to what could be achieved when human potential was systematically enhanced and social organization was optimized according to scientific principles rather than traditional customs and individual preferences. Its residents lived lives of perfect harmony and productivity, free from the conflicts, inefficiencies, and suffering that had previously been accepted as inevitable aspects of human existence. Martha Wickham, now fully integrated into the community's enhanced social system, served her new role with the same dedication and expertise that had characterized her previous work as a traditional healer, while contributing to research that would eventually benefit communities throughout the region and beyond. Her transformation marked the completion of Shadowbrook's evolution into something that retained all the external characteristics of a normal village, while operating according to principles that represented a fundamental advancement in human civilization. The professor's grand experiment had succeeded beyond his most optimistic projections, creating a community that functioned as a perfect synthesis of individual enhancement and collective optimization. Shadowbrook had become a glimpse into humanity's future, where scientific understanding would replace superstition, where social harmony would eliminate conflict, and where human potential would be developed to its fullest extent for the benefit of all. The mad scientist of Shadowbrook had achieved his ultimate goal, transforming not just individual lives, but the very nature of human society itself, creating a new model for civilization that would eventually spread far beyond the boundaries of the small village where it had first been perfected. The future belonged to communities like the new Shadowbrook, where science had conquered the limitations that had previously confined human achievement and social progress.